All right, so look a little bit more at sound today. We looked on Tuesday or Monday, just sort of very simply looked at the waveform to know how to sort of time our type to that if we want, timing our different sequences. And so just to kind of recap real quick, create a new document. If I've got a sound clip like this, and if I open this up, it has a waveform. Zoom in on that. All the high points of that waveform are a specific beat. This particular track has a left and a right channel, but they're pretty much blended channels. They're the same. Some audio tracks will have separate left and right channels, so they do different things. And you can use those, appropriately. But basically, we're just using these high points to kind of define where we want our type to come in at. And we kind of looked at with just a simple changing the source on a line of type to change words from on one beat to the next. So that's one method. There are things you can do with this. A couple of things to point out. A lot of times, whether you've got sound, an audio track where you want to identify certain beats that you use frequently, or you've got an audio track where you've got to match changes in the audio to changes in the visual. A lot of times this will takes a bit of space, especially if you get a whole bunch of elements in your timeline. You can, if you place your playhead, like I'll place it right here where this beat is. If I tap control, what is it? Control. I can put a marker in. Control K. I always forget what the control is. Control. Apparently I should have looked that up before I started too. There we go. Add a marker. It's Control B to add a marker. And it's under Layers, Markers, Add a Marker. And you see within this timeline, it'll place a little marker right there that if you double click on, you can put comments about that particular point in time. So you can mark out your timeline, mark out if you've got a script, whatever it is, to identify areas where you need to have a change. So just kind of work your way along. And you've got to actually have it selected. So work your way along, put in markers. Control E. So you got that visual reference. And then you can close that up and you can just kind of match up to those markers. So the second thing to point out is that you can change the so there's the audio, there's that audio line. If I want to change the volume of that, here under decibels, I can increase that. Make it louder. Drop it to make it softer. -8. And you'll see that the waveform changes accordingly, so you kind of know what you've done. But most soundtracks, most music tracks or audio tracks you'll find are going to be longer than your 60 seconds. So unless you're able to adjust that so that it ends at a very convenient spot within the track, you probably are going to want to try to sort of taper off that audio, maybe even bring it in the same way. And these audio levels are keyframeable just like anything else. So if I leave it at 0, I'll set like 2 seconds, I'll set a keyframe for that. Bring it back here and just drop that down. It'll kind of taper it in, bring it in. So you can ease those keyframes, do anything else that you need to those. They act just like any other set of keyframes. So pay attention to that when you're putting your compositions together. That make sure that you end your music, bring it in places that make sense. And you can duplicate these, cut, and move them. I mean, usually you can find a good spot to kind of adjust the length of time. At a low spot is when it's quietest. So any of these low spots, if I wanted to lengthen this up or lengthen this out, I could loop it at the end, use an expression. But a lot of people like to avoid expressions, which we can't entirely, but I could always select this, duplicate it, find let's get rid of those. Slide this along, identify. I mean, I could just match them up at the end, but it might be better to actually just sort of find a spot in the middle that's a low point. And maybe pick up a particular note at that position, trim it, and then come down here and trim this one. Of course, we're going to pick up on the top one. But you can sort of lengthen out audio clips in that way. Especially if it's a very recognizable beat, something that's pretty consistent. It's a little tougher with longer scores, but that's a fairly simple way of lengthening a pair of audio clips. So that's the first thing. So we can also use these waveforms, we can also convert to keyframes. So if we want to animate a background or a secondary element to our audio, we can do that. And so we can, and the nice thing is that it literally just creates a set of keyframes that with an expression, we link to another element, usually a transform property, a property of an add-on or a plugin, and use that audio to drive certain transformations. And we can do, as a way of an example, we can use that to kind of set our scale, opacity, positions, pretty much anything. We can even use it to, we looked at different text transforms. We could use it to drive those text transforms as well. Anything with an animatable property we can link that to. And the way we do that, let's create another composition. And that's just what's this one look like? Okay. That is that same one. All right. So the way we do that really with just our audio is if we right-click on it, we can go to our keyframe assistant, and sitting at the very top of that is convert audio to keyframes. And when we do that, you'll see that it creates, it creates another element on our timeline for the audio amplitude. And if we open those up under the effect, we'll see there's a right channel, a left channel, and one for both channels. When we open those up, there's a slider, and basically those are keyframes for our entire waveform. So with this, I'm just going to delete the right and the left channel here since they're both rolled up into this both channels. And if I click on my slider, if I click on my waveform, you'll see that it creates a set of keyframes out of that waveform, hitting all the high points and the low points. I can see those a little better when I move in, but it creates those keyframes. So, and those are what we're going to work with. And the way we're going to do that is, and I'm just going to create a circle, center up my anchor point, and then center it on my on the composition. And with that, let's make a that for something else later. And then get rid of that. Just use that orange and tan. So on my ellipse, I'm just going to drag my audio input to the top, make sure the slider's visible, and then on my shape layer, go under my transform settings, and if I hit the Option key and click on my stopwatch, that'll open the expression panel. And rather than actually write an expression for this, all we really need to do is take this pick whip that exists right here, this little curly Q. Grab that and drag it up onto this slider. So, and we can tie that into it. So what it does is, it treats within that waveform, if I go back and take a look at my waveform, the lowest value or the zero value, it treats as zero. The highest value, it treats as a percentage or a scale. So if I look at this waveform and hover my mouse over the bottom of it, you'll see that at the very bottom, it's like 2.07 units. The little yellow block at the bottom of that kind of tells me what that value is. My highest one is 23.42 units. So it's really it's scaling this from 0 to 24% of what my original scale was. which is why it looks so small. There are a couple of different ways to combat that. And the first, and for most things, if you're only animating a single property, probably the simplest way is within this expression here at the bottom, do one of two things. This is the entire expression, and it ends with this temp. If I put my cursor in just before that and type value plus, that will reset the scale to the original values of the object that I started with. The other way to do that is actually, this is a little more flexible. This will just simply take the original values, use those as a starting point, and then animate from there. If I undo that though, the other way to do that is at the very end of this, type a plus with an open bracket, 100, 100. And that'll do the same thing, except that if I change these to 50, it'll change that scale, but on a smaller, smaller size. It takes half of the original size. So when you're using this, if you use this technique, like I said, it's kind of nice just for a background of some kind, maybe a secondary element, but it's definitely something you can do, and I'm sure there are videos you've seen that do, use this fairly heavily. You can, tie those together. So I don't know if I do 100 here. You can try different values. So, and these are the left, and the, keep hitting return, which I don't want to do. These two values represent your Y and your Z. So if I change it to 50 and 100, I get something a little different. So those are kind of good to know. And I can use those values to switch these back to 100. And then I can always if I duplicate that, say I change the color of the second one to something a little bit darker. The scale, I can drop this to 50 and 50. So get those to do, put multiple objects in, use the same audio track to drive it. I can make audio amplitudes as many times as I want. I can convert that soundtrack to a set of keyframes. And if you want to do things that that vary, that's sometimes a good way to go about that. So it's a fairly easy technique to implement. It does, there are some expressions involved which most people shy away from, but the thing is you can apply those to absolutely anything. So I could apply that to, let's give this a stroke. All animatable options. that up. Use that pick whip. And you can animate the stroke that way too. So what if I want to add a different, I'll add the opacity into this as well. Actually, I'll add it into one of them. So there's orange 1, I'll do it to orange, yeah, we'll do it to orange 1. Contents. Open that up. That slider. Do the opacity. So if I want to control that up, so it's doing the same thing there. It's where I made this modification on the scale to take the original, to have it affect the original size of the object. I would have to do a similar thing to the opacity. The problem is that the opacity doesn't really have that kind of a setting. So the other way to go about that is to select our slider, go into our graph editor, and you'll see there's our expressions down here. Select that. So I can also adjust that with expressions by this particular one. It's, what is it? Oh, I can adjust that linear size by typing linear. There. Linear, and it takes 5 values. So basically what we're going to tell it is that we want the values of this waveform. Get an error here. Start that over. Let's do that differently. Yeah. Let's undo that. Leave that one alone. Keep. All right, do that again. It will, if you change, what I had happening was I kept changing my trim space all the way down. It'll only convert the keyframes to the trim space you have selected. So let's delete that. Do it again. Convert audio to keyframes. There we go. Open that up. Effects. And like I showed before, I can hover over the bottom one and see what that value is, 1.79. I can hover over the top one and see what that value is. That's my highest, 23.42. So I'm just going to type an expression that's linear and says change the values. One, we'll just round that up, maybe make that 2, comma, 2, comma, 23.42, so 2 to 23. We're going to change to 0, the values of 0 and 100. Value, not values. So it does kind of, so that combined with what I did before kind of increases that sizing, gives me a little bit better control. And it's kind of jerky, kind of, abrupt. All that this linear in this expression tells is that it's the equivalent of, when we said easing, and by default it's one point that has just a straight line that goes down to another point. This is simply the easing that it's using. So if I type ease, you see it gives me a variety of options there. It'll kind of smooth that out a little bit. It's not quite as harsh and abrupt, and it gives a little more variation in the movements. Like I said, you can use those, use that technique to drive pretty much any animatable property. So, but it's another way of synchronizing audio and action. If you don't want to use the music track, you can also always select within this value graph, you can select all of those and draw them out. Like if I turn off my sound, it's the same motion, but it's kind of retimed it a little bit by doing that. So if you're just looking for a random motion of some kind, that might be a way to look at it and to work with it. All right. So actually, that's kind of convenient. So I can kind of remap the time of that waveform by just selecting all of those points and scaling it out. I could probably apply easy ease to all of those, but that'd get fairly complicated and probably give us some really kind of weird results. So I'm not going to do that, but so that's how you can kind of synchronize action to an audio track. Expressions are one of those things in After Effects that seem pretty complicated, but usually you just write expressions for specific things you want to do. Most people. People that are real power users of it that do a lot of really big motion graphics packages will write an awful lot more to control different things. But just a few of them will kind of get you through a lot of that. And usually when you need to do it, After Effects will give you notes, give you tips as you're writing. If you've got an error in it, something wrong, it'll tell you that, it'll at least tell you there's an error and tell you why. Sometimes you just kind of got to figure it out yourself, Google it, whatever you need to do to kind of find the right answer. So that's, between Tuesday and that, a couple of different ways of working with sound, animating elements. So we can also, on video elements, remap time on those. And there's a couple of ways to do it that don't involve a lot of in-depth kind of expressions or anything like that. So I've got a composition, and I need to import. I want to use this, Cars on a Highway. Drag that down here, and turn off its audio. Don't want to see that. So, fairly simple video clip of Cars on a Highway. So if I want to speed this up, it's really just as simple as, if I right-click on that clip, go to time. I can also get to that through the Effect menu. Effect, time. Right-click, time. Enable time remapping. What that does is places a pair of keyframes at the very beginning of your clip and at the very end of your clip. So our video runs at this pace, but if we grab this back keyframe and slide it over to, say, 10 seconds, we can speed that clip up. So and that's a simple way to speed up a section of a clip. If you want to speed up the entire thing, it's a little different process, but a very simple method of speeding up a clip is just to sort of apply that time remap. You're only doing a 60-second spot. You'll only want to do it for probably a short span of time anyway. So you can speed up a clip that way. Most of the time when I want to change the time on something, usually what I want to do though is slow it down. So if I create another comp, bring the same cars in. If I right-click, there is under time, there's time stretch, which will stretch out the period of time. And by default, its stretch factor is 100. So if I change that to 300, say, you'll see that it'll slow that clip down. By itself, it's kind of choppy. You see, because basically what it's doing is it's taking all those frames, stretching them out over, I did 300, so it's taking each frame, stretching it out over 3 frames. If I toggle you don't have these up, if you toggle switches and modes on, there is, right next to our motion blur, there's a time remap option. And if we click on that, or frame blending actually is what it's called. If I click on that, it'll kind of fill in that gap a little bit, and there's two different methods to do that. But even that's still kind of, you see it's actually creating a new frame between the two, and it's kind of, it still has kind of a strobe effect. It's not real smooth. If I click on that again, it's pixel blending. And that looks a lot better. So that'll actually blend the pixels from one frame to another. It still creates those interstitial frames, but it will blend those to make them look a little smoother. So you can remap time to pretty much anything you need to those two ways. So that's that frame blending option. So in terms of something that's maybe a little more practical though, if I've got another comp and I'm going to import a different clip, I got a picture of some flames. And if I want to set, if I've got a section of type, center that up. And I'll drag that flame image that I've got on top of that. I'm actually going to use that type as a mask. So I can use my text that I'm animating on screen as a mask, but within that fire looks it's still pretty choppy and whatnot, so I can use those flame blending features or slow that down. Time stretch, I'll set to 300. And set pixel blending. And I can make that a little bit smoother kind of a effect. And actually it's probably too slow. Half of that would probably have been better. But you kind of get the idea. You can, all the stuff, like always, is very stackable. We can animate our scale. Animate our text in a number of ways that we want to. don't know 100% what the result is if I get, I'm going to do it. Let's see. Sound, let's do that. Keyframes. Right channel and our left channel, get rid of those. Both channels. Open up our text. Option key and see what we get when we link that audio track. Advanced. Change that from characters to words. Go back to my slider here. Save. 2, 24, 0, 100. So by stacking all these different techniques, you can do some different stuff. Let's do ease in. It's a little smoother, not quite as choppy. So, by themselves, they're all just techniques to do one thing or another, but you combine them, you kind of start creating some interesting kind of stuff. And, playing around with the settings is hands down the best way to kind of start getting familiar with it and doing it an awful lot. If you don't do it very much, remembering the things you figure out, can get to be kind of tough. But that's why I save everything. Most of the things I do whenever I mess around and play around, I'll save them in compositions, name them what they are, so I know what it is, so I can always go back and look at them. They're motion tests, which is something you should be looking at before you get too deeply into your animations. So I think I have on the timeline motion tests, different ways you might want to animate your type for Monday. Some other things we might want to do. This light blue, let's make it something different. Merriweather. Remember, we got all these different effects and presets. I mean, maybe you want to make type that looks like a wave, sort of transitions in and out that way, there's a variety of different options. We look at wave warp. It's really just a matter of kind of working with a lot of these different settings. You can, with wave warp, it creates sort of a little wavy kind of a pattern, but adjust the height of the waves, the width of them. You can adjust the direction they travel. The speed. All sorts of different things, if you just look them up or ask. If you've got something in particular that you want to try that you can't really work out. Now just create sort of an endless motion. You can animate all those points, or simply fade them in and fade them out. Look at the speed graph on those. Different kinds of effects you can work with, toy with. Let's see. So one other thing I was going to show you, and then give you the rest of the class to work. Let's see, I'm going to make a solid. That'd be good. And I'm going to pick a different soundtrack this time. Something different. Select that and audio waveform. So when you this audio waveform, again, it's just sort of an effect. I've seen a few things that are kind of cool. Basically, you tie the audio waveform add-on plug-in to an audio source. So I want to tie it to, within my settings, tie it to my sound, and if I zoom in on that, you'll see that it starts to distort that line. So if we play it, increase the height on that. displayed so the gap between, it's by default, it's the settings are kind of plain, but by messing around with the height, the number of samples, which are the number of points within that time within the waveform, offset, change the thickness of the line, the colors of them. So something like that. There are also different, this is using analog lines, but if you use digital, let's raise the resolution. Digital just creates vertical lines, and you just got to kind of mess around with the settings to kind of work out what works best. There we go. Kind of start to see those a little better. And we can change the start and the end point of that. Up. There. So we can stretch the start and the end out here. Reduce the number of samples, and so it just puts it on a straight path by itself, but I can get this to work right. If I put, say, a mask into this shape, let's see what we got. Select mask 1. Expand it. We can wrap that waveform around different shapes, different paths. Purge my caches. Yes. So some interesting effects with stuff like that once you apply the masks and, you know, try different things. I mean, you can change the colorization, inner and outer, blend them. Analog dots. Some sort of different interesting kinds of effects. offset. Oh. That didn't really work, but reduce the height on that should sort of reduce the spread. But when I did that originally, if you noticed, it was all kind of confined to sort of a square. That's because I within the shape that I applied it to, I created a path that's a mask. And so it's constraining to the bounds of the mask. But if you expand it, that opens that up so you can work with it. Let's see. Increase the number of samples, height. So, stuff worth kind of messing around and playing with. You can tie all of these back to, actually maybe, don't know. Exactly what that'll do, but you just got to kind of work with it. Wow. Sometimes it's playing around with it until you kind of get it right. I mean, there's really no substitute for it. So that value is what? These are much higher values than the other one had. Higher bit rate, I guess. $35. So let's do 5. Messing around with them. So I do So it's really just kind of playing around with them until you get results that you like. Okay. All right. So just kind of, play around with settings. I mean, you've got things that, thoughts in your head. Part of the point of the storyboards, motion test, that kind of thing, is that you're working unencumbered of what you can actually do with the software. So, generate your ideas, then figure out how to produce them. All right. Just ask, or like I said, look them up. There are plenty of videos online that can help you out with that too. Chances are, if it's something you want to do, somebody else has done it already anyway. There's not a one of us that doesn't do that. So look it up and let somebody else do the hard work. All right. So use